Patrick. Hi, everyone. I think almost everyone on the screen knows me. So I'm Michael Lardner from the Marxist Education Project. With us today is Patrick O'Hare, who is in the UK right now, but has been in Montevideo, Uruguay for a number of times and has done tremendous research on the new phenomenon of hygienic enclosure. And I really can only figure that out by the two words in combination, and I can think of it, but Patrick has done the real work investigating these places, working with the groups of people who are affected by this, and has done a lot of other research in this area. This book is available from Pluto Books, and anyone who wants to buy the book, if you put the initials MEP in the discount code, you will get a 30% reduction. Patrick, that affects your royalties, I'm sorry, but they do.
It's all good.
I would like to turn the floor over to you, Patrick, because people did not come here to hear me. They came here to hear about your book. So take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Do you think I can? You could enable screen sharing for me?
Yes, you're the co-host. You are now the co-host, and you can do whatever you want.
Brilliant. I just thought I'd show a few photos as well while I talk about.
Yeah. Great. There you go.
Okay, brilliant. Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to talk about my new book. New York's the only place I've ever been in the US 24 hours, for probably about 14 hours, where I visited the Tenement Museum. Was the main thing that I did in between eating pizza and donuts and bagels and all these kind of things that people say you should do in New York. So I'd love to come back there one day and meet with you all in person as well.
That'd be great.
So I'm a social anthropologist. I'm from Glasgow originally, and I've been my PhD in Cambridge, for which that most of the work for this book was undertaken, and currently I'm a research fellow and senior researcher at the University of St Andrews. So as Michael was saying, I was spent a number of years in Uruguay. I was there the first time in 2009-10 when I first started working with Uruguayan waste pickers known as clasificadores. I was then again for my doctoral research in 2014, and then again in Uruguay for a year from March last year until a week ago, 6 days ago, when we arrived back in the UK. I suppose I'd quite like to start just by saying how I became involved in working with waste pickers and interested in it. And I was there as an undergraduate on a year's exchange doing Spanish and social anthropology. And one of the things that struck me about Montevideo was that in amongst few high rises, certainly a lot of modernist buildings and architecture, all the sort of infrastructure you'd expect from quite a modern city, you had the recycling labour was carried out by people who mostly went about on horse and cart, and would travel in from the periphery of Montevideo into the centre, like recyclables, and then move through a network of intermediaries and eventually reach an industry or export. And I sort of made a first overture to some of these waste pickers known as clasificadores. And I went along to a film screening, and they introduced me to a cooperative, and I started working with what was Montevideo's oldest waste picking cooperative. And their families had moved around the landfill in order to access the landfill. They were poor rural urban migrants to the city of Montevideo, and they'd been attracted by the landfill. During that first spell, when I was there in 2009-10, I didn't actually manage to reach the landfill, what they call the cantera, or the quarry, or the dump. Cantera usually translates as quarry, and the use of that term dates back to when waste was dumped in old quarries in Montevideo. We really also index their extractive relationship to this space, which for local government was a place for dumping, but for them was a place for extraction. And so I didn't manage to make it to the cantera on that first visit, but they'd spoken so much about it. And I ended my undergraduate thesis with a quote from one of the waste pickers from the cooperative, who expressing his frustration that every day so many valuable things were being dumped, and they wouldn't allow waste pickers, clasificadores, to access them, even though they had done historically. So there was this frustration that they were having to go out and collect recyclables in different points of the city, and within sight of their own homes, they could see all this valuable plastics, metals, objects that could be reused rather than recycled being dumped every day. And so with that in mind, I was intrigued to go back and do my doctoral research and start to explore, really put the landfill in the centre. And the landfill, Montevideo's landfill, was the centre of this book, as well as being the centre of my research, my doctoral research. And so this is some of the kind of activity that I engaged in for the book research for it. So I basically worked as a waste picker alongside clasificadores in recycling plants, in family yards.
What meeting is this? It's my Marx education project, but this one's on.
Okay, brilliant. And in the landfill itself. So this is me with some of the waste pickers at the landfill, who are also known as classifiers or clasificadores, and also the ones who enter into the landfill are known as gateadores, or crawlers, for the way that many times they would have to crawl in under the fence that was erected around the landfill. And so this research, from the day-to-day, I could sort of understand how difficult it was to access, what kind of conditions they were working under, the threat of the police, the threat of eviction, also the not considerable amount of money and could be made from working in a landfill, and the kind of objects as well that could be extracted and that would help to subsidise household expenditure. So as well as entering into the landfill, working at these different yards, I also accompanied the waste picker trade union, the Clasificadores trade union. And so they are, at least at that point in time, and I think it's still true today, they were only waste picker trade union that were affiliated to a national trade union body or congress, which is in Uruguay. All trade unions are each industry in each sector only has one union, and they're all joined together in a general congress. So there's no competition between them. If you're working in the chemical sector, if you work in the oil industry, there's one union for you, and all those unions are joined together in one trade union federation. And so waste pickers form part of that as well. And one of the regular activities that we would do was to protest alongside them outside, mainly the local regional council, municipal council, when they would bring in various measures that would affect waste pickers' right to circulate in the city and horse and cart, and right to access different materials. Part of the research, and I had to show this little photo today after a nice old firm victory for Celtic, from my local football team Celtic over Rangers. I used to also engage in different neighbourhood activities. So one of the things that I was interested in was going beyond waste pickers as waste pickers, and also seeing, have taken a more rounded picture of them as people, as subjects, as neighbours, as they engaged in different activities in neighbourhood life. And part of the reason for doing that, and or at least one of the things that came out of that, was this idea of waste pickers challenged this idea of waste pickers being very marginal, being very discriminated against, because what you could see is that they were a fundamental part of working class neighbourhood life. So they weren't your rag and bone man who would pass through the neighbourhood. They were neighbours who were just as respected and considered part of that neighbourhood and of neighbourhood life as much as anyone else, and often in fact they'd be earning more money than other people who were involved in a low wage, even formal economy. And this is, I should probably have had a map of Uruguay for you guys. It's slotted in there between Argentina and Brazil. This is a more localized map of the field site. the book, and this is the main sites that I would work at. Although of course I would follow waste and waste pickers further afield as they circulated in the city. In certain respects, there's a bit of a traditional neighbourhood ethnography about this book, though it makes a lot of international links as well. Rather than being based in various different places in the city, I was firmly based in what was a housing cooperative that actually also back in 2009-10 helped to construct alongside the waste pickers who were in a cooperative. So basically they weren't working waste picking every day. They said, if you want to hang out with us and get to know us more, you need a hand on a building site. And so we went along and helped in that housing cooperative project, where people who'd mainly previously lived in a shantytown on top of the dump in Montevideo managed to secure land and funds in order to build more dignified housing, was still within a stone's throw of the dump. And one of the things that was interesting about this housing cooperative was that it had a rural and an urban part of it. And in the rural part, you could still engage in many of the activities which were adjacent to their waste work and were connected to their waste work, such as having horses, where they'd have horse and carts, and they'd use the horse and carts to collect and transport waste. They also were able to keep pigs, and they'd feed the pigs with food waste that they'd collected from the dump and so on. This is the Felipe Cardoso waste complex, which straddles two different neighbourhoods, one of which was an industrial neighbourhood that previously had a main employer, which was the brick industry. There was a brick kiln there, and most of the neighbours would work there until that closed. And the other one really started off as a neighbourhood of people who'd moved to that area in order to work at the dump. And then it had grown and diversified in different ways as well. So here you can see there's closed landfills, there's active landfills, there's leachate treatment plants, there's hospital waste, there's methane capture, there's a new landfill. So there's a lot going on here. There's a real sort of ecosystem of waste, and which is treated in different ways, and to which waste pickers are connected in different ways as well. So part of what I was interested in doing in the book as well was really tracing out some of the history of waste disposal in Montevideo and clasificadores' relationship to waste. So just very briefly, Uruguay, and this is part of the argument that I'm going to talk about as well, about infrastructural modernity. Uruguay for a long time has really modelled itself on being a European country, aspired to be a European country, and really looks to Europe in terms of its ideals for modernity, and that seeps into waste disposal as well. So Uruguay has prided itself on being the first countries, or the first country in Latin America to have waste incineration at the beginning, organised waste incineration at the beginning of the 20th century, with incinerator ovens that were brought over from England, and then so as this period of incinerating waste, and then it shifts to landfill in the 1960s, 70s, and then landfills centralised in Felipe Cardoso at the end of the night, around the 1980s. So, and that's where the 5, 6, 7, and 8 on the map are representative of that area. But I want to talk about Wasteless Commons as well, which I'm sure you're all here and interested in, and why I started to use that framework for thinking about waste in the city and how it might have a wider appeal beyond and just beyond Montevideo. So I was on one of these, in this particular case, it was a roadblock alongside waste picker trade union and waste pickers from a particular area. And this is how I open the book as well. This is a very emblematic area for Montevideo. It's called El Cerro. That's the hill. Uruguay is very flat. This is one of the highest points in it. Third highest point, incidentally, is the landfill. At the apex of this hill, there's a fort, and that's the fort of El Cerro. And this used to be a very working class neighbourhood of Montevideo. It's where the meat packers were situated, and the streets have these different names. It used to be called Cosmopolis, and it has the streets have these international names that refer to the workers who travelled from different parts of the world to Uruguay. So there's Russia, there's England, there's Spain, there's Italy, there's Brazil, and so on. And it's bath time here in this house, so I might have a few shouts from my daughters in the background. So one of the, I might actually just let her run out and stop her shut. You know, these things happen. So one of the reasons why I started to think about waste as a commons was because on this demonstration, one of the slogans was "La basura es de los pobres" or "La basura pertenece a los pobres." Waste belongs to the poor. So rather than it being a claim on waste that everyone should be entitled to access waste was from it belongs to everyone. It was really, we're the poor, we have a right to access waste, and it kind of turned on its head as well a lot of the policy terms that were referred to the waste pickers as kind of marginalized groups, or as a kind of lumpen proletariat, or as, you know, excluded group, identifying as poor and saying it's by dint of being poor that we have historically accessed waste what other people don't value and have given up ownership claims over. And the fact that there's a horse and a child in this photo is obviously important as well, because these are human and non-human figures that clash with what's deemed acceptable in terms of waste management in 21st century Uruguay, right? I mean, particularly child labour, of course, but also very much the idea that you could have a horse in the modern city was something that policymakers from left and right, they had a serious problem with, and which whenever I try to defend, when talking to these people, there's really there's absolutely no tolerance for having these horses in the city, which is something that waste pickers have historically attached to. So that's kind of commons number one, the fact that there's a vulnerable group who's claiming a customary right over a resource, right? Then also I started to chart some of the oral histories, the social history of older waste pickers, and this really became key as well. So in this photo we have Selva and one of her grandchildren alongside, and holding in the picture her own grandmother who'd worked at one of these meat packing plants. And checking the chat there, just an off from my part, that's good. And so she was one of the people who told me about this period when landfills were free. She called them, and other waste pickers from her generation called them la cantera libre. And her story is quite indicative and typical of waste pickers of her generation, how they'd started working. Her husband was in the military, he was away for long periods of time, he wasn't very attentive to his family, she was living in penury, and she had to find a way of maintaining an income and supporting her household while also caring for her children. Uruguay has a welfare system, but it's mainly based around work, and wasn't necessarily meeting the needs of, it was a labour-based citizenship, as in Argentina, strong trade union movement, but someone, a mother whose husband's in the military and is a rural urban migrant, wasn't necessarily catering to her needs. So a friend of hers said, come along, I know a place where they're throwing material, right? Están tirando, and she didn't know what this language referred to. Y puedes juntar, you can collect. So she, her interest was piqued. She was quite desperate, and she went along, and it turned out to be a landfill that the Montevideo City Council was operating on a temporary basis, and where you could first travel back and forth with their kids. And then eventually they installed themselves there, put up a little shack. They'd stay there 5 days a week and work, and would recycle it, would sell paper, metal, glass, and so on. But they would also be given materials with which to construct housing. They were given food by lorry drivers from particular factories, so the chicken factory and the sausage factory and the butchers and so on. Started to have these relationships and build up personal relationships with some of the drivers, and they'd be given materials. And so this really, for a lot of waste pickers, was seen as a kind of golden period, like cantera libre, the free dump, where they were able to move around the city, accessing materials as one dump closed and another one opened. And there was even these sort of semi-idyllic sort of reveries at times for when the landfill was placed near the beach, near a river, on the outskirts of Montevideo, and so people who were rural migrants quite liked this. They could, they could go for a swim every day. They could go by the river. They could pick flowers. I mean, this is some of the accounts of people that I'd worked with. And then came enclosure. Let's see, where's my next? Okay, not yet. Then came enclosure, which is probably more like this, right? That's probably more what enclosure looks like. And so basically, when Montevideo's landfill was moved to Felipe Cardoso, that was the first time that police began to be stationed and fences started to go up. And so there's a bit of a debate about why that happened. Was it because there were fights between clasificadores or waste pickers? Was it because the municipal workers and the police wanted to get the best material for them? Whatever it's unlikely one single reason for why police police were stationed and fences were erected, but it was certainly part of this move, this global move towards more controlled and sanitary landfill. Right? And this is partly why I talk about a hygienic enclosure, a process of hygienic enclosure, that's linked to these principles of hygiene and what's deemed hygienic and acceptable in waste management. And so really they start to take an example from the United States. Fresno was the first sanitary landfill. They start to take examples from other European countries and to say, actually, there's no place for the poor here. There's no place for people who are not municipal workers. They can't be allowed to access this site. And they start to throw up the fences and station police. And really very soon, there's this strong repression of waste pickers who try to enter. And this is something that, again, what Uruguay at the moment is trying to evict waste pickers from lots of the landfills where they currently exist in what's called the interior del Uruguay, so capital and other rural regions. And what I often say to these policymakers as well, okay, you might think it's undignified for waste pickers to be there, but if you're really going to enclose the site and evict them and try and enforce that enclosure, then you'll very soon find yourself resorting to violence, however well-intentioned you might be. And that's what has happened historically at Montevideo's landfill. So there's been police on horseback, there's been police with dogs, and this was particularly aggravated during the period of Uruguay's dictatorship, so 1973 to 1985, when waste pickers were sort of rounded up, taken to detained, tortured, taken to police cells and so on as they tried to access waste. And as they did so, in what I call it, a moral economy as well as a political economy of discards. I mean, they often would say, we are kind of jobs that are available to us in the shanty towns and what we see our neighbours doing, or maybe theft, or maybe drug dealing more recently, and we're trying to earn an honourable living, dignified living by accessing something that other people have no property claim over because they've thrown away and it doesn't belong to anyone. In fact, it belongs to us because we are vulnerable and it's what we use to sustain our homes and our livelihoods and so on. So just to go back one slide as well, or a couple of slides. When waste pickers separate materials at the landfill and more recently in recycling plant, they talk about a few different things. They talk about material. Material comes to be, your plastics, your paper, your metals, and so on. And they also talk about requeche. When they're collecting what they call material, they're very much inserted into a national capitalist and international capitalist global recycling trade, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that. They can collectivize at different levels. Sooner or later, it ends up, they're dictated to by international prices a lot of the time, and sooner or later it ends up with some of these big recycling companies. Although, of course, there's been moves across Latin America for waste pickers to try and scale up and to replace some of these companies at intermediate scales, to cooperativize and be able to add value to material themselves, to be able to process them and not only be at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, and it's often spoken about in those terms. But certainly there's no denying that they're part of world markets and often capitalist markets. When they collect requeche, and that's something that I focus on in the book, it's slightly different. So requeche, and here's a a representation of a pile of rekeche, someone set to their side as they're also pulling out. I think there are cans here you can see on the right hand side, on my right hand side. Here's a couple of things that they've pulled out of the trash as well. All the waste pickers with whom I worked in the landfill and in plants would do this. They would separate what they would sell by kilo, by ton. But they would also make this other little pile of things that still had use value, had been discarded. In this case, probably by a household, because this recycling plant serves and only operates on the basis of household waste. So someone's saying, okay, here's a small sieve, here's a tea sieve, here's a household cleaner that still has some product left in it. Here's some stock cubes, right? Different things that they could take home and either use at home or circulate within with friends and family. If you scale this up to waste pickers who are working at the landfill and receive all the waste and discards from industry, you're talking about not one stock cube, but 100 stock cubes, 200 stock cubes. And so as I was living and working with these people, I realized how much of the household expenditure could be replaced by things that could be sourced at the landfill, that were different forms of rekeche. So you're talking about clothes, you're talking about sheet metal to mend your stables, you're talking about pallets in order to construct fencing, you're talking about school books, you're talking about different types of food. And so really this all goes on to form part of an integral part of a kind of subsidy for waste pickers who then no longer have to take on these particular items of expenditure. So all of these things started to make me think of the landfill as a type of common. You have a vulnerable population that's making a claim over materials, who are making a claim of usufruct rather than of ownership. No one's saying that they own the landfill. They're saying that we have a right to access there and extract use value from what others have given up a claim over. Have the fact that they are vulnerable populations such as widows, single mothers, rural, urban migrants, Afro-Uruguayans, many of whom had travelled to Montevideo or had been in Montevideo and experienced racism and found that the landfill operated as a sort of space of exception where they didn't encounter the same types and forms of and intensities of racism that they did in other formal sector jobs. The landfill was also functioned as a sort of refuge for these people, and at the same time a refuge from wage labour. And so what I mean by that is that not only was it favourable to some formal sector jobs to wage labour, but it also meant it gave waste pickers greater choice over which jobs to accept. So they always knew that if they were treated badly in a plastics factory and a biscuit factory, is some of the jobs that come to mind that people pickers had engaged in, could always fall back on landfill, and they would express this in terms of saying, "Bueno, me voy para la cantera." No, well, I'll just go back to the cantera. They knew they had somewhere local that they could rely on, where they, in their own terms, wouldn't have a boss. They would be their own boss. They could control their working day. They could enjoy feelings of autonomy. And so, all of these things in the book, I draw it out in more detail, echo some of the features, particularly of English commons in the 18th and 19th century, although of course Irish commons as well, Scottish commons, particularly the historical research that I engaged in, where I was looking at the work of M. Neeson, E.P. Thompson, and more recent historians as well, but in their following in that tradition, echoed some of these characteristics of access to the commons, and of course enclosure. Right? So you have this attempt at enclosure, which is nevertheless different. Right? It's a different type of enclosure. When we used to go to the landfill, we'd sneak through the fence and we'd make holes in the fences. So there was this kind of visceral, physical tearing down of the fences, which echoed some of these earlier forms of resistance to enclosure. But whereas the English lands and fields that were enclosed were done were enclosed on a basis that it would improve rural productivity, that you'd be able to put animals in there, you'd be able to put crops in there, and you'd be able to farm and crop and pasture more intensively. What's going on in Montevideo with the enclosure was something quite different at first anyway, because no one else, it wasn't the case that anyone else was going in and taking out those materials and saying, we're going to do this in a much more productive way. It wasn't the case that private companies were going in and saying, you know, we're going to organize this business and we're going to make it a lot more profitable and we're going to make it a lot more productive. In fact, it was very much the case of no one should be allowed to access these materials. And it was tied to capitalism and accumulation in a slightly different way, which was that alongside household waste, alongside some of the street factory sweepings you'd find being dumped in Felipe Cardoso, there was also perfectly good products that were being cleared because a new range was being brought in. So there was a real attempt to prevent materials being commoned, being circulated in these family networks. They may well, of course, have been extracted and then sold, but they very often were circulated in family networks and helped to sustain these relations of kin and neighbour. And so, for example, waste pickers spoke about La Fili used to dump electrodomestics in a pit in the landfill or in perfect working order, and they would dig them up. And it turned out La Fili was Philips. It was the Philips company that when they were wanted to renew their stock, they would simply get rid of the old stock by throwing it in a pit in the landfill, and waste pickers would unearth it. And those sorts of practices would still continue. Perfectly good items that were being dumped. And of course, there's all sorts of scandals about this with Amazon and so on. They do with their surplus stock at a more global level. But these practices continue to happen. So much so, unfortunately, things have become a lot more tricky for waste pickers, where instead of them simply being dumped in a pit, now in order to make it to the landfill, have to be destroyed. And they use the Spanish term inutilizar. They have to be made useless, have to be ceased from being useful. So here in the book, I discuss this difference between waste as discard and waste as useless material. And so effectively, what waste governance does in Uruguay, what the waste legislation does, is it turns everything that you want to discard into waste. But in order for you to dump it, you have to inutilizar. You have to make it useless. So you have to not only send it to Felipe Cardoso, you're not only obliged to do that, but you're also obliged to pass it through an intermediate company who basically ends up being shred whatever material you've got and dump it at the landfill. And this is all seen as part of responsible waste management, right? Actually, once you start to talk and understand why it is that these things are being destroyed, what's the rationale behind it? It's to stop the knowledge that waste pickers might get their hands on it and they might circulate it within their networks. And the big brands and the large companies want to stop that happening. Of course, it doesn't always completely happen. It doesn't always stop. And there was different points of the year, and we'd read in the newspaper that that certain companies have been obliged to get rid of however many tons of chocolate, and that would actually find its way to the dump, and only some of it might have been destroyed, and the rest of it could be recovered by waste pickers and they'd circulate in their network. So they're continually trying to get their hands on material that they call sano, they say is still healthy, it's still good to eat, it's still good to use, it's still intact, it still has a use value, even though it doesn't have an exchange value. And this kind of tension between use and exchange value is something as well that's explored in the book, where a lot of the time what's happened to a product in order for it to be sent to the landfill is that some of the packaging has been damaged, right? So if you think about Unilever and sachets of shampoo, which is how they distribute shampoo in a lot of the global south, is in these little sachets, which are quite cheap. If you have a roll of 50 sachets, one of the sachets is damaged. The other 49, because they're sold in a block of 50, the other 49 automatically lose their exchange value. So and they're dumped. But of course, the use value is still there, even if one particular sachet is damaged or one form of packaging is damaged. So let me just This is just, I'll end with an example of the direction that some of this enclosure is going in today. So this is a photo from back in 2014 where waste pickers are accessing a truck of non-fit that contains waste from a steel forge. And what's coming out of the truck alongside dirt and dust are non-ferrous metals. Non-ferrous metals, which are tend to fetch a higher price than scrap. They're not the raw material for the steel forge, and so they end up being thrown out with the discards. These previously made their way to the landfill, and they could provide an income for about 12, a dozen, 15 waste picker families, right? There was so much metal that was coming out of these, 12, 15 families were able to support themselves. In the meantime, in the interim between 2014 and now, these trucks have now been rerouted to a private company that deals in non-ferrous metals in Uruguay. So, they're the ones that where all the copper in Uruguay is recycled ends up in the hands of this company. And so they've managed to actually intercept the truck, sign a formal agreement between the two companies, and now all the discards coming out of the steel forge are going to this company that deals in non-ferrous metals, and they're able to cherry pick the best stuff, and then whatever's left then goes to the landfill, and it really is considered rubbish. And this is kind of, and of course, these two companies celebrate this arrangement, and it's seen as a contribution to the circular economy, because what was happening before wasn't actually legible or recognised or known about. So it was just seen that these materials were being dumped in the landfill and weren't being taken advantage of. And so now it's seen that, oh, brilliant, all these resources are actually being recognised. It's resource rather than waste, but actually you're cutting out the weakest link in the recycling chain and cutting waste pickers out of a new emergent circular economy. And this is happening across the board in Uruguay with moves towards formalization. So one of the things that was protested, that waste pickers were protesting about back in 2014, was the fact that small businesses and commercial waste were no longer able to allow waste pickers with whom they'd had a very long relationship, customary relationship, where they'd collect the materials, were no longer allowed to give them recycle it. They had to sign an agreement and a contract with a formal sector company who were moving in and establishing themselves. And of course, waste pickers were given barely any support in order to formalise their activity, and the ones that were able to do so tended to be the kind of the bigger fish, so to speak, in the pond. So these moves towards formalisation have really impacted and cut out and dispossessed a lot of the waste pickers who traditionally had relied on this as a way of living. So I think I'll finish there. I've probably been going for about half an hour or so, given we started at 10 past. And hand over for any questions, and hopefully have a nice discussion.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick. Can you bring us back to the full screen?
Yeah. I'll stop share. There we go.
Dugald, you have quite a comment there about Cairo. Would you want to say something about that, Dugald? I don't even know if he is here. Just wrote that. So what he wrote is that I think there are some factors of similarity with Cairo in the 80s. Everyone can read this in chat. Their garbage was collected by children with donkey carts. That they belonged to an extended clan that lived in a district called the City of the Dead, a Muslim burial area. Some of the garbage ended up there as fuel for small artisan cement manufacturers, burning rubber tires, and open fires to heat the local limestone and clays. Obviously, horrendously unhealthy air quality. I don't know if it continues, as he hasn't been there in a while, but did you see any evidence of the oligopoly of aluminum producers' abuse of the market for recycled aluminum waste?
Quite a specific question. No, I mean, Waste pickers were selling a whole range of materials, although they specialise in some. So aluminium was, or aluminum as you guys have it, tended to have quite high prices compared to the others. So there wasn't really a sense that they were being choked by a particular monopoly. The case of IRO has been studied by a colleague of mine called Jamie Furness, who's worked with the Zabalin. So they're called the Zabalin, although I think they contest that term in the same way that waste pickers in Montevideo used to be called rummagers, and have sort of redefined themselves as classifiers rather than rummagers. But the Zabalin, who are Christian, a Christian minority, although there may have been some Muslims engaging in it as well. They were this. They've certainly, at a global level, have been one of the sort of most vocal defenders of a right to access waste as well, and a kind of way of redefining their work as something that's dignified. And Cairo has been one of the cities where there has been these moves and the privatization of waste collection with the multinational companies, and that's really possessed the Zabalin and negatively affected their work. So I suppose there's two strands to that. There's the defense of the access to waste as a means of livelihood, and then there's also would you have an oligopoly, and what's the situation in terms of the control over and the setting of the prices for materials, and whether the buyers are in together and setting, as a cartel, or sort of setting prices. And the latter definitely does happen. I mean, not solely. I'm sure it happens with aluminium. I'm sure it happens with others as well. So one of the recent demands of waste pickers, as they've organised, has been to join together and achieve better prices by selling in bulk and achieving economies of scale. That's been relatively successful in different countries. Really, they've only managed to replace the intermediary, often the small town, small scale neighbourhood materials depot, recycling depot, and so they haven't necessarily managed to influence the prices that the bigger fish, higher up the recycling chain, the actual industry, the manufacturers have been setting for the materials, whether they buy them from intermediaries or whether they buy them directly from cooperativized waste pickers. So that's still a bit of a tension. And at a kind of ground level, waste pickers often change between different buyers, and do have a certain degree of agency over some of those prices, so that they're quite savvy, and there's often a sort of what they call it the war of the scales, where they feel they've been robbed at the scales, but then they also put things like tires and stones into the bags, and they let the cardboard get wet, and so they try and kind of offset some of these dishonest practices by engaging in some of their own dishonest practices.
Thank you. Michael Dola has his hand up, and Jamie is on stack. So Michael, why don't we take two questions now? Michael, you go first, and then Jamie after Michael. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. I really want to thank you for this work, Patrick. Fascinating stuff. If people, I don't know if you mentioned it, I came in late, so I apologize, but this reminds me, I happened to be lucky enough to take what was called a third world cinema class at Hunter College, and they showed Isla das Flores, Island of Flowers, which I think was from 1991. So people should check that out. It's on YouTube. It was translated and takes place in Brazil, someplace in Brazil, where, yeah, like the gut punch at the end, to spoil it, is that the pigs have to be able to scavenge before people can come and pick through the designated area. So in New York City, this makes me think of bottle recyclers and the intersections of anti-Asian violence and bottle recyclers. I mean, just on the level of like a New York Times story talking about the antagonism between recyclers and like private companies that, of course, are greenwashing. I guess my last thing, and I guess it's also an issue of capital intensity, so when I hear about what you were saying, that they're organizing and trying to engage in a little bit of sabotage, the battle of the scales. I don't know the field like you, obviously. Tell me about how competitive they can be. It seems like a John Henry story, and at the end of the day, the organic composition of capital is going to rise. It's going to become more mechanized, and how do you self-exploit as a cooperative against that? Finally, sorry to put so much on the table, but it's just incredible to me. Are there public health dissidents in the state that are questioning the hygiene, explanation? And are there links to other struggles? So what are the support networks like? And really, finally, this is the fact that this is so ecologically irresponsible. And they rationalize it via IP policing is like, you can't write that. I mean, obviously, like Marx has written that, but it's insane. Thank you so much.
Well, Michael, you put a lot out there. Jamie, would you rather Patrick take your question on after? Okay, go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I'll try and pick up on a few of those points. So Isla Flores, absolutely great film. I'd recommend checking that out as well. And also recommend, in terms of Brazil, work of Kathleen Miller, who has an ethnography from a few years ago, which is reclaiming the discarded, and also some of her more recent work as well, which she sort of critiques the portrayal and representation of waste pickers in Wasteland, which is the Oscar-nominated, if not Oscar-winning, documentary charting the work of a Brazilian artist who's working alongside waste pickers at the same dump that's represented in Isla Flores, if I'm not wrong. So, in terms of the hygiene, so in terms of questions, I suppose you had a question about a hygienic dissident, and I mean, not really. I mean, what I often found was that the more almost like the more connected to international networks, and often the more highly trained people were in terms of municipal bureaucrats and so on, the less willing they were to countenance the presence of waste pickers, say, at landfills, right? Which is not to say that they might not have supported cooperatives, or they often had this discourse of we have to dignify this work. You can't have people like this. But actually, when you went to some of the, as I recently did, to some of the rural, slightly more rural landfills in Uruguay, where you have waste pickers there, they're sort of accepted as part of these guys have been here for years, they've been here for decades, and they have a niche, and they live relatively well out of what they're able to extract, given their particular circumstances and structural position. So, the pressure to evict these people is often coming from above, and it's coming from the centre. And they also have this same discourse as well of, this is all going to, surely this kind of work is all going to go, right? And surely it's all going to become mechanized as well, and it's linking to, they look at Europe and they look at the US, perhaps they look at China, but China often has a lot more incineration and waste to energy, but they see these big mechanical biological treatment plants, these big MBTs, and they think, oh well, that's where everyone's heading. Of course, they've had this sort of discourse as well, and this idea for decades, and if you still have manual classification at some of these plants as well, even in the global north and in the UK. And one of the differences really is, I noticed anyway from being in these different spaces, is how much alienation there is, how much people control their working day. And you visit a recycling plant in Buenos Aires, or in Montevideo, or in Rio, and you're going to find people who are singing, you're going to find people who have music on, you're going to find people who are joking, who maybe have a barbecue, who are maybe innovating with the materials, in the case of Argentina, right? Who are maybe coming up with new products and so on. There's a lot of social innovation, a lot of grassroots innovation. If you visit a plant a mechanized plant in the UK, as I have in Cambridge, you have magnets, you have infrared and so on, but you also have a conveyor belt with people. And the difference is that those people don't look very happy, and they might be earning comparatively more. They're not allowed to talk. I mean, they're not allowed to. The knowledge of the space, as well as the workplace discipline of the private multinationals that are operating these plants, just aren't allowing for any of the type of joking relationships, of fun, of control over working day that you have in some of these plants in Latin America. So I think that's been an interesting point for me. And yeah, I mean, it is surprising that the way the destruction of these of goods is still justified, and that was something that is in my book. And I had there's a couple who ran one of these environmental companies that helped to basically turn waste as discards into waste as useless material, and they are very well-meaning, well-trained, both chemists, and they just found themselves completely engaging in the work of, thought they could recover things. What they found themselves by law being obliged to do was to destroy things, and and then send it to landfill so no one could access it. So yeah, there's not much of a huge amount of a reception for my ideas or my critique in certain circles in Uruguay, and they've certainly come to me. I mean, I've written a report on waste picking for the Inter-American Development Bank, but there's certain areas they're just not willing to go, such as defending certain customary rights, defending certain forms of informal labour where a formalised alternative doesn't exist, or only exists for a handful of people. So yeah, there's not too many dissidents, unfortunately.
Jamie, your turn.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Patrick. That was really interesting. I've spent about 2.5 years living in Peru and Brazil, India, Nepal. And I've seen this over time, this kind of process between where people could just, 20, 30 years ago, we could just dump stuff everywhere. And there were layers of scavengers that would come through, call it scavenging just for simplicity, but you'd have people and animals, and pretty soon all you have is these colorful plastic bags left on the ground, or broken bits of things that are truly useless. But the dumping was essentially everywhere. And I know that still goes on in a lot of places. So it just strikes me that the longer global capitalism continues, the more niches will be, capitalized, and so you end up in this, this kind of a situation where these people are getting pushed out. And I'm just wondering if, back to your comment that all the unions in Uruguay were organized under one larger umbrella, is that meaningful in terms of political power, or power to help these people get different kinds of jobs or something else? I have a full circle comment here, because I just a month ago toured a brand new dump and recycling facility in Santa Barbara, California. So it's absolutely state of the art. And they made the huge point that they have as few people as possible working in there, because it's such crappy work and it's so dangerous and it's so unpleasant. But it's exactly what you just said, the fewer people. Well, maybe that's good overall, but only if those people are taken care of in more dignified, easier, less dangerous jobs. So I just kind of wondered if there's really any benefit to all that organization of all those unions in Uruguay in particular, or anywhere else that you know of. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jamie. There's a chapter in the book which is focused on my research with the trade union and some of the difficulties that they had. And I talk about it as a kind of mobile unionism, of how difficult it really was for them to represent such a diverse workforce, where some of them were informal, some of them were being recently formalized. It was kind of like seasonal work sometimes, where people would come in and out of the activity, or they'd do a little bit on the side. But compared to representing workers in a more traditional sector of the economy, the trade union work was difficult. And it was also difficult for them to make their voice heard within this wider trade union federation. So there was a lot of sympathy for them, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of joining hands or downing tools or finding strategies in order to work together. And I'm certainly a supporter of the centre-left government that was in power in Uruguay for 15 years up until recently, Pepe Mujica, Tabaré Vázquez, and so on. There's very strong links between the trade union movement and the government, and it's kind of became increasingly corporatist, and so there was room for dissent while the government was in power in terms of large demonstrations, in terms of any sort of strikes or anything like that, was quite slim. And so, in any time there was an election year, it was a case of if the workers went out, it was to defend the government and it was to defend the gains of the government. So, whereas, and they certainly had a lot to defend, and a lot of positive things for the trade union movement and for workers, but not necessarily for waste pickers who were increasingly kind of under the cosh of the centre-left government. And you have a centre-left government that's been in local government in Montevideo for 30 years. They first came in 1990, and yet there hasn't really been. It was during all these years that they've seen their access to waste increasingly sort of restricted. So, unlike in other countries, in that much of a success of mobilising through the trade union movement in Uruguay, and that would be the way to go because of how unionised Uruguay is and how powerful the movement is. Whereas in Brazil, we certainly have the trade union movement. We also have social movements, right, that are very powerful. You have, landless people's movement and so on. The waste pickers there have organised as a social movement and as a mass movement, and they talk about the movement rather than a trade union. In Argentina, have interest in development which are where they've been set up again more as a union, but as an informal workers' union, as a street workers' union. So again, sort of eschewing that traditional trade union model and having a lot more in common with the Gueteros, who emerged after the 2001 economic crisis. So using some of their methods like the roadblock, the cacerolazos. They do things like burn all the waste containers in the city, right? And when you go back, waste is obviously like waste workers historically have had quite a lot of power because they can kind of choke off that access to the dump. They can kind of interfere with the metabolism of the city. They can, and local governments tend to be pretty worried about how about the sight of garbage kind of filling up on the streets. And so I kind of went back to do some historical research as well. And in the 1920s and 30s, the anarchist trade unions in Uruguay were quite strong, and they would do things like just put bombs in the bins and stuff like that. So if anyone, in order to tackle any scabs who were going to go and sort of take any rubbish out of them, they just sort of put bombs in there, and like 4 or 5 people died. And so there's these very radical methods from back in the day. And although the trade union, the UCRUS, the waste picker trade union has actually quite a strong anarchist presence and Trotskyist presence and so on, but they certainly moderated their methods since the 1920s and 30s.
Ariana, it is your turn. Ariana?
Yes, sorry. So thanks so much for an amazing talk and book. And my question kind of touches on something you've been mentioning, for example, now in relation to organization as a social movement in certain places, what we've been talking about in terms of social unionism as well. So my question was whether how would you place the struggle for access to waste as a means of livelihood that we've been talking about and calling this way in relation to the labor struggle / social reproduction struggles divide or spectrum. So I was wondering, because it's been really exciting to hear you talk about the ways in which the movement, in terms of organizing, it was organized differently, either as a social movement or as a trade union. So I was wondering whether you feel that the movement, or just the organizing, or the struggle, whether you feel that it kind of, I don't know, cut across the divide, or whether in different places the focus is on more on social reproduction, or labor organizing. Yeah, thanks so much again for the book and the talk.
No, thank you, Ariana. Thank you. I mean, I very much see it as a struggle for social reproduction. What you increasingly have is, and it's a struggle for surplus, right? It's a struggle for the surplus of the capitalist economy. Of course, there's, and I guess this links a little bit to what Jamie was saying as well, about how you used to see these people who would move through and do this work, and that maybe actually in some ways, if it's mechanized and there's less people doing what is, what can be a dirty job, quite an unpleasant job at times, that can be good. So there's a lot of people who don't want this, to policymakers and so on, who don't want waste pickers to socially reproduce as waste pickers, right? There's the idea, well, let's find other jobs for these people rather than allowing them to socially reproduce in that, because they see that as a social reproduction of poverty and of extreme poverty. Whereas there's been a more widespread recognition in recent years that actually they're doing an ecologically very valuable job, and and they should be given a fair wage and access to these materials. And I think you can combine a subsidy and a fair wage with access to materials that they can then recirculate, that can be reused and so on, that it's not necessarily one or the other. But one of the things that's happened in Uruguay is that there's been this minority who've been included in recycling plants, and then their demands tend to be kind of split between wanting to access materials as they used to do, and also making a lot of wage claims, and have a slightly more direct employer upon whom they can make these demands. Although it's still actually relatively obtuse, because these plants in Uruguay are managed through a public-private partnership. You have the Chamber of Commerce paying people's wages. Then you have various public bodies, including the local government, who are also involved in providing the waste and providing some of the machinery and so on. So the immediate employer is the Chamber of Commerce, but you also have these other interlocutors at various levels. And one of the things I set out in the book is that there is this division by reclassification, and there's a dispossession by reclassification as well, on which is that a small minority are given jobs in these plants, at the very most 10%, probably more like 5% of Montevideo's waste pickers. And then some of the waste that previously used to go to waste pickers in the street with horse and carts are being redirected to the plant. And so you have this division of workers who are relatively privileged and have the benefits of social security, who are being pitted against waste pickers who've been dispossessed, haven't been able to get these jobs. So that's been a difficulty as well for the trade union movement and for the waste picker trade union, about how to combine representation of these two groups. I was previously on a demonstration, about a month ago, I was on a demonstration of waste pickers where there were only waste pickers from the recycling plant and nobody else. And again, this was quite curious to me, was also why they were there. And for the first time, they were actually there defending local government, who were trying to get a big loan for waste management in from the Inter-American Development Bank, which had been blocked by the right wing. they were kind of being manipulated in a way, and kind of brought in to try and, shake some pots and pans in front of local government building, secure a $80 million loan, of which only 1 million of the 80 million was going to be for them, and most of it was going to be going to a private company that runs waste collection and transport in the centre of the city. So that's just, I suppose, a little bit of the kind of ethnographic nuances of what's going on in Uruguay. I mean, another way to also talk about it and think about it and campaign on it is the right to work. And one place where waste pickers have been, recicladores, recyclers have been very successful is in Colombia. Talking about the right to the city and the right to work, and using the Colombian constitution and taking it to the highest level of the constitutional court in order to defend their access to waste. And they were actually successful, and moves to privatize in various cities were overturned, and they were able to maintain their access, although that's to go on a day-to-day basis. But they had these famous sort of victories using this discourse of right to work. And we have people in Uruguay, colleagues of mine, who work internationally with waste pickers, who tried to kind of use some of the same arguments in Uruguay and get the trade union to adopt some of these arguments, but it just hasn't quite worked out.
Jamie, you have another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, Patrick, your recent comment just segued perfectly to what my work now is in activism in climate change and environmental issues. That's once I learned, I couldn't unlearn. So that's all I do. So this whole garbage issue and garbage, rubbish, even the names we call it, how much of it is reutilizable, and changing things upstream is much more important than collecting at the end. But still, it is important. And I just wonder but like everything with trash, nobody wants to think about it. There's not much, study on it. There's not much publicity about it. And I guess that's why I toured that dump when I had a chance. I thought, well, this is a way to get a window into what's going on, at least in a, super, super modern context. But I guess I'm wondering, do you know anything about anyone who is collecting that kind of information, or have you seen any countries where the garbage collection process is being handled in a good faith way that has more to do with the circular economy and those sorts of things, rather than just an afterthought that's rife for abuse, and maybe a few success stories like the one you just mentioned?
I mean,
I don't know if that's a clear question. That felt a little vague to me, but maybe it communicated something.
Yeah. There's, in a way, you're right that people maybe don't want to think about their trash and the rubbish, but on the other hand, there's this thing that fascinates as well, and again, and it's also politically quite an important issue, especially for local government, as I say, when and that's historically been the case in Uruguay as well, where these pictures of bins overflowing are just this recurring theme throughout the decades in the media. When you want to announce the government, this is the images that they often come back to. And there's this whole field of discard studies now, which is
discard studies.
Yeah, discard studies. Yeah.
I love that term. See, I'm onto something there. I just didn't know it.
So, which are
discard.
So I could definitely, there's a discard studies blog, which was curated or maintained by someone called Max Liboiron, who is quite an important sort of scholar, who's at Canadian University now, and she's recently published a book as well, which might be of interest, which is called "Pollution is Colonialism." But there's a whole bunch of kind of mainly sort of anthropologists, geographers, sociologists. We're all working in these issues. I mean, another one that might be interesting for you guys as well is, I don't know if anyone's heard of this, A Mass Conspiracy to Feed People, which is David Border Giles' book, with Duke University Press, on the Food Not Bombs network, which recently came out, where he'd worked as a food not bomber for many years. He kind of and in Seattle mainly, but he was also in San Francisco and in Australia as well. He's carried out the work, and so an activist rather than the work, I guess. there is this kind of field, and in terms of your question about where people might be doing things well, it's kind of what you hold up as a metric for doing things well. So, you know, obviously the EU, recycling wise, does things a lot better than the US, and when Uruguay is looking to international examples, maybe they'll look to the EU generally, and then within the EU they'll look at, you know, Austria for composting, right? Or they'll look at Sweden for a combination of waste to energy. Uruguay used to be called, his nickname was the Switzerland of the Americas, and they still like to talk about, you know, Switzerland as this model that they want to aspire to. There's lots of links with Italy as well, and not such positive, benevolent links where they have a lot of Italian engineered trucks and things that are brought in, very expensive technologies where you could be in waste pickers, you know, a decent wage and probably getting higher levels of recycling. You know, and from a waste picker perspective, in terms of what we talk about as inclusive recycling, this is a sort of term that's, you know, how do you do recycling well in countries where historically you've had waste pickers who've been carrying out that labour? How do you do it in a way that you're concerned about them, you want to include them, you want to protect their rights to access materials, but maybe you also want to improve your recycling rate? And so countries that tend to do well in inclusive recycling have been sort of Argentina, have been Brazil, Colombia. And then when you bring the circular economy into it, opens up a whole new kind of can of worms in a way, and that's what I've been looking at recently. My recent research has been circular economy initiatives in the plastics industry and any intersections to the social and solidarity economy. So, you know, have there been cooperatives and non-profits who've also been making moves to make plastics more circular, which is a bit of an oxymoron sometimes. But one interesting thing with the circular economy is that it's not meant to be about recycling. And if you look at some of the key definitions and theorists of circular economy, they're not really interested in recycling, and recycling should kind of come further down. You should be redesigning, you should be reusing, and all the rest of it. It should, from a business perspective, these kind of business models of the circular economy, it's about servitization, and it's about extended product life and things like that. But because a lot of the big companies don't actually end up doing much of these things beyond a few pilots, quite often it then does come down to recycling. And then you have a debate about what kind of recycling model you want. And you have there's an Argentine scholar called Sebastian Carrenzo and Jutta Gutberle have an article about circular economy and recycling, and they call a standard recycling model, where you're talking about big multinational companies, and what are the benefits of that and disadvantages, and then you have a social, I'm not sure if they call it, I think they even call it a waste picker recycling model, and they talk about some of the benefits and disadvantages to that. So I'll put his name in the chat there, Sebastian. But one of the interesting things with, and I'll just do a little kind of aside about my more recent research, is that because there's not that much emphasis placed on recycling within the circular economy, it strangely means that companies that do something with design and maybe reduce the amount of plastics that they're using in a product are kind of celebrated because they've done something not at the end of the pipe, at the beginning of the production process. Then they might well be creating a product that is very difficult to recycle. And so they're kind of like, brilliant, you guys are innovative. For example, polystyrene trays, maybe they're using less polystyrene, they've changed the minute curvature of the polystyrene tray, and they're getting kind of prizes and recognition for that, but they're still producing a product which is incredibly difficult to recycle. And maybe they should be thinking about something else, and replacement, or at least strengthening R&D and the recycling of polystyrene, right? So there's all these, this is the kind of can of worms that I'm looking into at the moment with the
Oh, I'm so glad to hear it. That's really
to recycling.
That's great. I'm really of interest in that. I'll follow what you're doing. That's the way of the future, and I mean that's a hot topic. So that's great. Thanks.
Hey, Patrick, I calling on myself. I live in a suburb of New York City, and I've never been to Uruguay, but I imagine there is a suburban ring like most major urban areas. Is this phenomenon in the suburban aspect? Is it throughout the entire Montevideo metro region? Does the movement in any way go beyond that urban center to more of Uruguay?
Yeah, yeah. So it's quite a strange city, Uruguay, I guess, in terms of its spatial, in terms of its topography, and its spatial distribution. So you have Old Town, which was, historically affluent, but then became quite run down and in some ways comparable to sort of inner city. Then you also have some quite rich Rio de Janeiro style, relatively rich kind of strip along the coast, but then also some workers districts that kind of back onto the. This is where I should have a map of Uruguay, right? Back onto the coast. But then you have the shanty towns, and the shanty towns tend to be more directly kind of peripheral. So you don't have the Rio sort of rich and poor living cheek by jowl. You have, if you live in a rich neighborhood, you wouldn't really see someone from a peripheral neighborhood unless they're coming to collect your recyclables in a horse and cart. That's some of the central neighborhoods. What you used to get was these sort of relationships where you'd have a horse and cart would go to a relatively rich household and we'd give them their recyclables, right? And that was the sort of exchange. And they'd also give them, old clothes or things that they didn't want anymore, or things that might be fixed that you might be able to fix and things like that. And one of the things that's been taught is this with the formalization of waste disposal has been some of those relationships, either between relatively affluent households or between small businesses that used to give their things to waste pickers. And what's happened in the center of Montevideo, in this old town, and along the main street is called the Municipio B. It has been that's the area that these new containers have been spread out. Split containers where you put in your recyclables. They're really hugely expensive. You can only be operated with these trucks that cost $500,000 in order to open them up. Incredibly slow in terms of when you actually have to tip them out and open them. Specifically been designed so that waste pickers can't get in, but it also means it's very difficult to get materials in because you have a very small mouth and you can't actually fit a bag of recyclables into them. You have to kind of fit in item by item. Of course, it's something that then ends up discouraging households from going out and taking out their waste, right? You have to stand there and sort of put one thing after another. So I suppose the main spatial dynamic, to kind of summarize a little bit, has been because these materials have been rolled out, because these containers have been rolled out as a technology of enclosure in the more affluent neighborhoods, and because waste pickers on horse and cart have actually been banned from circulating in these very same neighborhoods, is that you have a kind of center-periphery relationship that's been cut and severed, and you just don't see waste pickers as much anymore. I mean, the distances involved in, because Montevideo is relatively small, it's not that sprawling. It's not that sprawling. You could travel the distance by horse and cart and get in and out of the city from the periphery to the centre, something that in Buenos Aires you just couldn't do. If you lived in Greater Buenos Aires, travel into the centre on a horse and cart of the city is just really difficult. Whereas Montevideo, you could actually do it. You could go in and out. And in terms of the circular economy, one of the guys, the secretary of the trade union, or the UCRUS, recently transitioned from a horse and cart to a tricycle, a motorized tricycle that had been exchanged through an exchange with the local government. And what he said was, as he was waiting to get this tricycle, which ended up taking forever, what I used to do was I'd get my materials that I would sell, the paper and the cardboard and so on. I would bring back stuff for the kids. I would bring back stuff. I'd have food for the horse, and I'd bring back food for the pigs. And so almost everything that he was getting on his horse and cart, he was able to find a use for. And that's a mobile circular economy right there. And it's the kind of thing that policymakers who are working on circular economy in Uruguay just don't see it. Just don't see it, because for them, a circular economy actor is, you know, an entrepreneur, tech savvy, who's got someone who's doing PR for them, who's got a fancy website, right? Just don't recognize that this is someone that actually, up until very recently, has been doing circular economy. So yes, that's some of the kind of spatial urban dynamics that have been happening in Montevideo.
Can I add one more comment? Just as with a Marxist heart and a climate change focus, ecological focus, the part of this that's the most offensive is the purposely making things useless. You know, that part of this, talk about waste. I mean, that's real waste. I mean, you know, there are always going to be stuff left over, but that's real waste, and it's just cruel. I mean, it's greed and cruelty in stark relief. I wonder, as you look into your circular economy stuff, I'm sure you'll be paying attention to that and seeing, you know, there are a lot of local movements I know of around where I live where they collect food from the restaurants and take it to the shelters. I mean, things like that to try and avoid that deliberate, you know, breaking the stove so that somebody can't take it home rather than just putting it on the street and letting somebody take it. I don't know. I'm just venting now, but maybe you'll, you know, see interesting things about that. I look forward to your next book on that whole subject.
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I tried to do is bring together some of these activities that take place in the global north with waste picking activities in the global south. And part of that is through it was based on my own experiences of when I was a student in Scotland. We would go out with I had a couple of anarchist pals, and they would go and do this freeganism and skipping and go to the supermarket bins and recover materials from there. And so I used to go out with them at night. You know, they'd clava up because there was security cameras, and they'd get in amongst the material and they'd see how much, you know, particularly fruit and veg was being thrown away, and we'd take it out. And we had this sort of battle where they started to put locks on the supermarket bins, and then one of my comrades sort of glued the lock shut, so then they couldn't get in, so they ended up cutting off the lock, and we sort of were allowed to keep rummaging and getting the material out of there. And as usually there's this sort of division made between a more middle class freegans and activists and dumpster divers in the global north and waste pickers in the global south, who are seen as doing it for survival reasons because, you know, they have no other option. It's a sort of last resort. I kind of try to bring them together because, you know, they do share a lot of, you know, it's not only the practice that they share, it's also, you know, a critique and a moral outrage a lot of the time about how much stuff that's sano can be used is either being purposefully destroyed or just being dumped rather than being distributed, or rather than allowing people to access it on a free basis. And I also make the point that a lot of waste pickers in the landfill in Montevideo could do other jobs and have access to other jobs. They tend to be low-paid jobs where they have a boss and are not treated well, and have this. They don't have these feelings of autonomy that waste pickers have when they control their own working day when they work at the landfill. So yeah, thanks, Jamie.
So there's two more hands up. Carlos, you haven't asked a question yet, so you go first. Then Michael, and we'll take a few more after that. So go ahead, Carlos.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for the book. I'm looking forward to this, and Professor Millar's as well. So I live in a graduate student apartment building at Columbia University, right by their main campus, and so not every day, but almost. There's lots of, besides the trash, there's lots of recycling put out in front of the buildings here, and by the main campus, by the undergraduate student dorms and everywhere else. And here on the streets, we get waste pickers coming not several times a week, I would say. And from their phenotypical appearance, they appear to be from Central America, Mexico, I guess some indigenous. so they're here all the time, and and it's particularly, I guess, for plastic and glass, and maybe some metal that they pick out, and they, you don't only see. When I used to live in Washington Heights, that was the same. Although sometimes there were Afro-descendant people as well, but it's overwhelmingly those. I take it migrant communities coming in. Sometimes they come with their families, their children, and whatnot. I guess I'm not asking for a north-south comparison. I would just to make the point that it's happening absolutely here. I assume New York is typical of the cities across North America, and I don't know. Do you have that within UK, continental Europe, Ireland as well? And I guess the one question I would ask comparatively is, so this is multinational migrants that are here. I assume some are undocumented, if not most. Do you have migration within either Buenos Aires, Colombian, the cases that you mentioned, Buenos Aires, Colombian, southern or southeast Brazil, Uruguay, are any of them either multinational, or do they come from like states further afield in the larger countries, not Uruguay so much, but the other three? Thanks.
Great, thanks, Carlos. Yeah, there's definitely this sort of relationship to that. It tends to be migrants who are carrying out a lot of this work, whether they are, migrants, or in the case of Uruguay, you're talking about second, third generation rural to urban migrants, as it puts, so within national borders rather than transnational migration. And that's the case in Brazil as well, where you have a lot of migration to the grand metropolis from rural areas of Brazil. And in Uruguay, there's been quite a lot of Latin American, or Uruguay at least, there's been quite a lot of Latin American migration from Cuba and Venezuela in recent years, but none of them seem to have got into the waste trade at all. In Argentina, there's a lot more of it's mainly Argentines who are already sort of second, third, fourth generation Argentines who do this work, rather than say Bolivians, Peruvians, where there are large Bolivian, Peruvian, Paraguayan populations in Buenos Aires, but they don't tend to be the most prominent figures or find themselves working with waste too much. And in terms of Europe, certainly, there's in Italy, I know of some research has been done there, where it tends to be African migrants who work, for example, in the scrap trade, who've engaged in that kind of labour. And in the UK, for example, the recycling plant that I visited, was a lot of Eastern European labour who were there, but not that was kind of formal labour, as opposed to people who were doing it, at a street level or informally, which tended more to be the case in the Italian example. I mean, part of what waste as a commons, as opposed to waste as a form of low-paid labour for a multinational company, right? When you're processing waste as a commons on the street as something you can access, it gives this first foothold for people who don't have necessarily a secure migratory status, right? They might not be fully legal in terms of their right to work in a state, and so the availability of waste as this commons is really important. And you have to be careful when you formalize that type of work, when you say, well, let's make sure that people have social security and so on. You're not broken off a lifeline for people who actually will find it difficult to gain those benefits, and perhaps don't want a spotlight shone on them because their migratory status might be quite precarious. The case in the UK, in terms of ethnicity, the case in the UK where there's been a lot of pressure has been on traveller gypsies who are ethnically Roma or traveller gypsy, who historically carried out the scrap trade, and a lot of restrictions that have been put into place that have affected their activity. So yeah, in a lot of cases, globally, you're finding either migrants, or you're finding minorities who are carrying out a lot of this work. Religious minorities in the Middle East, Christians, Abilene, and so on. Muslim majorities and minorities in places like Senegal, if I'm not wrong, and it's a minority there. But the work of Rosalind Fredericks, who I think is New York based, who's a geographer who's worked in Senegal. So yeah, certainly there's transnational comparisons and a lot of commonalities between North and South.
And Michael Dola, go ahead.
Thanks for the second shot, Michael. And thanks, Patrick, for the international scope. Something you and Jamie brought up in your back and forth. I guess I'm asking the same question a number of ways, but what are the waste pickers? What do they say about, like, do they articulate the connection between the environment and their work, what they do? And maybe more important, I mean, I would assume that they obviously understand, the irrationality of the system. So I'm wondering, like, how they articulate that, and whether or not they are able to get a word in the sort of local or even national conversation where it comes to ecological movements. It strikes me that, like, Fridays for Future or other, like, international movements should be putting these people, in the spotlight, not because necessarily the social reproduction of it, although maybe it does, but it points a way forward, but just because of it brings up the issues of the commodity and why capital doesn't let this go. Right? Why can't we just have this waste in commons? And shouldn't it be the case that everybody has access to it? Well, no, right? Like, it's not an ethical question. If they can put it back into circulation, they will. Thank you again.
Great, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, in Uruguay, definitely they've adopted that sort of discourse, waste pickers, of saying we are, warriors for the environment, environmental warriors. And this priest who was involved in helping the change public perception towards waste pickers and change their nomenclature from rummagers to classifiers. In an early article, he called them, ecological prophets, and that's from about 30 years ago or so. So they've certainly adopted that discourse. How many bridges they actually make to the environmental movement is a bit that's a bit more doubtful. And so, for example, Fridays for Future in Uruguay, the perception I got that from that there was that it was a very middle class movement from, like, private schools. Even the fact that it was like they call it Fridays, and this use of the English, which is, the upper class kind of pepper in their speech with English words that you just don't really find so much in the more working class neighborhoods. Like, I never saw any sort of link between the people who were buying Fridays and working on plastics and then waste pickers. Certainly, at a kind of regional level and at a global level, waste pickers are organized, and they are in these fora. And you have the Red Latinoamericano, the Recicladores, Red Lacre. You have there's a world recyclers movement as well. And for example, one of the areas where they're starting to make their voice heard is in the whole plastics debate. So with this recent UN Nairobi Declaration on Plastics and the upcoming sort of, act on plastics, or treaty on plastics, certainly sent representations there, because and they have a delicate position, because, for example, they can be manipulated by the beverage industry who and the plastics industry who churn out a plastic bottle, saying, and making a common cause with them to continue to produce these single-use items the way that have been produced. But of course, if they were suddenly banned, it would also cut off a livelihood and a source of income for a lot of vulnerable people. So, I think they need to be in these fora in order to help shape future environmental policy and circular economy policy.
A last question from me, Patrick, and I think you've addressed it somewhat, but as waste workers in general organize and have union representation or some type of collectivization, how effectively can they watch out for their health and safety? I would imagine that there is tremendous risk anytime anyone opens up a garbage bag to go through what's in it. One never knows. Just walking down the streets anywhere, there are so many shards of the waste that pieces of metal, glass, sharp plastic, whatever. There and beyond that, the toxicity of what is being handled without being labeled. We when we go through our products, we get warnings. They have no. People could dump anything into a can, a bottle, or any other container, and I would think that this is in some ways more dangerous than working in a uranium mine in a way, in that there must be so many compound chemicals and gases that come together that there is tremendous life and health risk there. So I'm not really posing a question, but how is this being addressed within the movement?
I've just popped a wee article of mine into the chat where I'm looking at carity and bringing in these elements of health and safety as well in the article, and sort of into different sites together, or they're analysing and comparing these two different sites. One of which being the landfill itself, and one of the new plant. So one of the main reasons and advantages to having these recycling plants is supposedly that it's a lot better for health and safety, and people get uniforms and people have gloves, and also the waste stream they are receiving has been reduced to household waste. Although they want it to be commercial waste as well, but all that they're allowed to get in Montevideo in these plants is household waste. And so, but there's this counter discourse from people, which I find quite interesting, from people who work at the landfill, and there's a quote in there from one of my interlocutors who said, you're not going to see anyone at the landfill wearing flip-flops. I've worked here for 40 years, for 50 years. Yes, it's informal, but this is my livelihood, and I know how to take care of myself and risks in the landfill. And one of the things that they say as well is that they recognise the truck, and they're only interested in kind of bulk industrial scale material. So they're not going to open up what they call la bolsita, a little plastic bag, or even like a bin bag generally. Stuff is coming in loose off the back of a skipper and a lorry, and you're pulling out cardboard and you're pulling out plastics. And so they're sort of saying, for us, this is relatively safe. Whereas for the recycling plants, you're obliging them to open up these little bags and check out what's inside. Now, of course, in the little bags, it's only domestic waste, so you're unlikely to get certain types of chemicals, but you will get others. And this STS scholar, Brian Wynn, writing many years ago, and the quote was picked up by some more recent scholars, says that, well, actually, household waste will be toxic waste in a lot of instances. You can't control what people are putting into the domestic bins. So that's some of the sort of discourses and counter discourses that go on in Montevideo. And what I'm wary of as part of this critique of hygienic enclosure is that the critique of the sanitary conditions isn't used as an excuse to dispossess people and to evict them from their places. And there's a certain amount of truth to the fact that people have been working somewhere for 40, 50 years, know how to manage that risk. And I saw very few sort of accidents happen at the landfill. And like other commons, there's a coming together and a discussion of who can access it. And yeah, certainly personal protective equipment has been sort of distributed there. Seen Michael's comments as well. Although there has been these cases as well in the plants where they've had to sort of pick the chamber of industry for more gloves or to increase provision during the pandemic and things like that. So there's certain accusations of stinginess from the workers who are there. But certainly it's a live issue and an ongoing topic that is important for clasificadores, both informal, who are working informally, and newly formalized and recycling plant.
Michael, I don't want to, or Patrick, I don't want to, I'm looking at Michael
That's good.
and you. Patrick, I don't want to keep you from your daughter too much longer. Does anyone have a final question? I look forward to getting your book, Patrick. And as I said, if you go to Pluto and put MEP in the discount code, you will get a discount. I should let everyone know, next Saturday, Mark Dudzik, who some of you may know, he's been working on the Medicare for All campaign, but he is a tremendous researcher on conditions of the working class in North America, is talking at 2 o'clock on Saturday on reinvigorating the Medicare for All movement. We don't have a national healthcare here, Patrick, and
I've heard.
It's rather distressing. The day after, we have David Harvey. Most of you probably know who David Harvey is. He's talking on the double consciousness of capital, but we are also having two researchers from St. Petersburg who we arranged for before the war, who are going to be speaking on loft offices, factory towns, some of the causes of polarization inside Russian society, speaking on the same panel with David Harvey, along with three women from Brazil who will be speaking on the far right corporate power and their struggles, the working class struggles in Brazil. And that is next Sunday at the same time as today's event, 2 o'clock. All of this is on the MEP website. Really great show, Patrick, and very good work you're doing. The plastics work seems very important. I just found out that when I put those clamshells in those plastic clamshells, they're not recycled because there's two kinds. The hinge plastic leads to the automated recycling machines rejecting all those clamshells. It's insane that this
that's aspirational recycling. When you put it in,
Yeah.
you hope.
And Jamie, this must all end up in the oceans, down in the bottom of the Marianas Trench. As we know, there are microplastics at the furthest depths of the ocean now. So
There's estimates that there's more plastic in the ocean than the mass of the animals in the ocean, or getting close to that. I mean, it's so unbelievable. But a lot of that can be traced to certain major river systems too. I mean, we all pollute, but a lot of that could be handled because it's targeted in certain locales where a lot of that comes from. So that's not quite as unmanageable as we act like it is, but we need to get our act together, that's for sure.
when I grew up, I lived near the paper plant that made gum wrappers for Wrigley. And in those days, they dyed the juicy fruit labels. And the river in my town, as I rode my bike over the bridge for the baseball game, would be the color of whatever the gum wrapper that day was, quite often yellow. And
Wow.
this went on for decades. It's not like it was a one-time leak. It was that way every day. And the vestiges of that are still hanging around.
Yeah, I grew up south of Philadelphia, and as a child, I lived in a very working class neighborhood, and we went past all these Sun Oil refineries, and the smoke was just coming up everywhere. And now I have some lung problems that they think are residual effects of breathing the air for 18 years. So anyhow, it's an area that's considered environmental racism hub, but I think it should be called an environmental classism hub too, because there were a lot of working class people there too. Anyhow.
Everybody needs to take care of their externalities.
Yeah.
My least favorite word in the whole world.
Yep. And I have to say that I was prescribed an inhaler for my lungs, and I went to pick it up, and you know how much an inhaler costs? $565.
Well, that's why we have to fight for Medicare for
I
all.
know. I mean,
Marion.
it's an obscenity. You just almost can't imagine it. I mean, we can do it. You know, my husband and I both have doctorates, but the idea that you would get charged $565. I mean, all the kids with asthma, are they paying $500? And I looked it up, and it said when they banned Freon, they had to make new inhalers, so they were able to patent the new inhalers, and that's why they're so expensive. I mean, Jesus Christ. pardon me.
Capitalism on steroids, and we're the guinea pigs in this country. We're as bad as anywhere.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
you know, it's the greatest nation in the world.
Yeah.
I think that moved to Britain because of the health insurance.
Well, will there be a true international waste pickers association union? That, I mean, I would think that we're not going to survive as a species if we don't transition away from capital. There's no way. It just can't. It won't take place. And we will have this long transition. And it seems that the work the waste pickers have done will be one of the more vital areas of skill we will need during the reconstituting our planet for the survivability in many ways.
So they do exist as the Global Alliance of Waste Pickers, which is supported by WIEGO, which is this US-based women in informal employment globalizing and organizing NGO who kind of support a lot of them. So,
Well, great.
Wow. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Patrick, this was really a great Sunday afternoon, and we thank you very much. And it was great meeting some of you people that I've never met before, and come back again. And bravo to all. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation. It's been great. It's been lovely to meet you as well. And I'll try and join again for this time, same time next week. It seems like you've got a great lineup for that. So
I'll send you a link. If you want to come, I'll just put you on the list. It's no problem.
brilliant.
Yeah, I think you would be able to. I think you would like all three presentations. Okay.
Absolutely. Brilliant.
All right. Bye, all.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.